The wind screamed across the high plain, a raw, indifferent sound that tore at the peeling logs of the solitary cabin. Inside, the woman huddled by the meager fire, the smoke stinging her eyes as much as the memories that clawed at her. Sarah. They had called her Sarah once. Now she was just here, cast adrift by circumstance, left by loss. She had found herself at the edge of the world, dependent on the silent, formidable man who lived in its heart. 20 years, rumor said, he had been here, carving his life out of the rock and the wind, a man as unyielding and solitary as the landscape itself. Her stay was temporary, she'd told herself, a desperate refuge. But the days bled into weeks, and the vast, empty land seemed to swallow her hope like the sun dropping below the horizon. Fear was a constant companion, cold and sharp, settling deep in her bones. Fear of the wilderness, of the isolation, and most of all of the man himself, whose silence was a wall, whose gaze, when it rarely met hers, was unreadable, ancient like the mountains themselves. He provided food, shelter. He spoke only when necessary, his voice a low rumble. She was a ghost in his life, a problem the world had deposited on his doorstep, and his tolerance felt fragile. Every creak of the cabin, every shadow that shifted outside, sent a tremor through her. She was a trespasser on his solitude, a reminder of the world he had deliberately left behind. Then, on a day when the sky was the color of bruised plums and the wind carried the first bite of coming winter, something broke the rhythm of their desolate existence. From the west, figures appeared on the horizon, small against the immensity of the land, growing steadily larger. 3 of them, women. They rode on ponies, their forms wrapped in blankets against the wind, their faces obscured. They stopped some distance from the cabin, dismounted, and approached on foot, their steps deliberate, unhurried. As they drew closer, Sarah saw their faces, framed by dark hair, their expressions unreadable, their eyes fixed on the cabin. They were Apache. Her breath caught in her throat. What did this mean? Had they come seeking refuge? Were they a threat? The man stepped out onto the porch, a rifle held loosely in his hand. But there was no tension in his stance, only that familiar, implacable stillness. He watched them approach. They reached the clearing before the cabin and stopped. And then, one by one, they knelt in the frozen dirt. 3 women, kneeling before the silent man and the cabin that held her captive hope and fear. The air thickened with unspoken purpose. Sarah watched from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs, a new kind of terror coiling in her gut. This was not just a visit. This was something else. Something monumental, ancient, and utterly outside her understanding. Their silent arrival, their kneeling, spoke of a transaction, a purpose she could not grasp but felt the weight of instantly. The man remained on the porch, watching the 3 kneeling figures. The wind whipped their blankets around them, but they did not flinch, did not stir. The tableau held 3 women, kneeling in the harsh land, before the solitary man. And Sarah, the hidden observer, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet. The man descended the steps slowly, his boots crunching on the frozen earth. He walked towards the kneeling women, not quickly, but with the steady, measured pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going and why. He stopped a few feet from them. For a long moment, he simply looked at them, his gaze moving from one to the next, his face revealing nothing. The silence stretched, taut with anticipation. The kneeling women remained still, their heads bowed slightly, a picture of quiet dignity and profound uncertainty. Sarah watched, every nerve ending screaming, trying to decipher the meaning of this tableau. Was this a custom? A consequence? A delivery? Finally, the man raised a hand, a simple gesture, and pointed. He pointed at the woman on the left. She was perhaps the youngest of the 3, her face a study in stoicism, her eyes dark and deep like mountain pools. There was a collective, almost imperceptible shift in the air. The man lowered his hand. He turned and walked back towards the cabin. The woman he had pointed at rose slowly to her feet. The other 2 remained kneeling for another beat, then rose together, mounted their ponies without a word, and rode back the way they had come, disappearing into the vastness as quickly as they had appeared. The chosen woman stood alone in the clearing, a solitary figure against the immense landscape, watching her companions depart. She did not look towards the cabin immediately. She stood facing the west, her back to them, for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly she turned. Her gaze swept over the cabin, over the porch where the man now stood again, over the window where Sarah stood frozen, hidden. There was no fear in her eyes, Sarah realized with a jolt. There was only weary acceptance, and perhaps a deep, hidden strength. The woman walked towards the cabin, her steps firm. The man stepped aside as she reached the porch, allowing her to enter first. She crossed the threshold and paused, her eyes scanning the small, Spartan space. Sarah retreated further into the shadows, feeling like an intruder in this new, strange dynamic. The woman's gaze found her in the dim light near the fireplace. She looked at Sarah for a long moment, her expression still unreadable, before turning her attention back to the man. He closed the door against the wind. No words were exchanged. The man gestured towards the hearth, then towards the small storage area where food was kept. The woman nodded once. It was a silent transfer of information, of roles, perhaps. Sarah remained in the corner, observing the new arrival. She was shorter than Sarah, sturdily built, with a quiet economy of movement. There was a stillness about her, a profound self-containment that Sarah, with her frayed nerves and constant anxiety, could only marvel at. The man busied himself with putting away his rifle. The woman knelt by the fire, holding her hands out to the warmth, her eyes still assessing the cabin, her new, unexpected home. The air in the cabin, already thick with unspoken things, now hummed with a new tension, a new mystery. Sarah felt a complex swirl of emotions. Fear, yes, but also a strange, tentative curiosity, and perhaps a flicker of something akin to relief that she was no longer the sole focus of the man's silent tolerance. There were two of them now, navigating the deep waters of his solitude. The chosen woman did not speak. The man did not speak. Sarah dared not speak. The wind howled outside, and inside, three strangers began the long, silent process of simply existing together. Days bled into weeks. The silent woman, whose name Sarah learned through a single, softly spoken word from the man one evening, Chayton, moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency. She took on tasks without instruction, building the fire, preparing the meager meals of beans and dried meat, mending clothes with deft fingers. Her presence was not intrusive, but it was undeniable. Sarah watched her constantly, fascinated and wary. Chayton's silence was different from the man's. His was a wall, a deliberate exclusion. Hers seemed a natural state, born of a life lived where words were perhaps less necessary than keen observation and quiet endurance. She rarely met Sarah's gaze, but Sarah felt the weight of her presence, a silent acknowledgement that they were now bound by this strange circumstance. The man, too, seemed to subtly shift. He remained solitary, spending his days hunting, trapping, checking the perimeter, but his movements inside the cabin felt less burdened, less pointedly alone. There was a rhythm that developed between him and Chayton, a silent communication of shared tasks, a passing of tools, a mutual understanding of the demands of their harsh environment. Sarah remained on the periphery of this new dynamic, still a ghost, but perhaps a less fearful one. The constant, sharp edge of her anxiety began to soften, replaced by a dull ache of uncertainty and a grudging respect for the woman who had arrived so strangely and integrated herself with such quiet strength. The first real test came with the snow. It arrived without warning, a sudden white fury that descended from the mountains, burying the landscape in drifts, trapping them inside the cabin for days. The cold was absolute, seeping through the logs, pressing against the windows. Supplies dwindled faster than anticipated. The man became grimly focused, rationing food, checking the roof. Chayton's quiet efficiency became essential. She banked the fire expertly, made the thin soup stretch, moved through the confined space with calm purpose. Sarah, used to feeling useless and afraid, found herself watching Chaitin, learning from her quiet resilience. One afternoon, the wind howled with particular ferocity, and a section of the roof began to leak, a dark stain spreading on the logs, dripping onto the floor. The man swore under his breath. Chaitin immediately grabbed a bucket. Sarah, without thinking, moved to help, finding a cloth to mop the spreading water. It was the first time they had acted in concert, the three of them, against a common enemy, the indifference of the storm. Later, sitting by the fire, the leak temporarily managed, Chaitin looked at Sarah. It was a brief glance, but in her dark eyes, Sarah saw not judgment, but a simple, weary acknowledgement of their shared predicament. In that moment, a fragile thread of connection formed, not of friendship, but of mutual endurance. The storm raged outside, testing their shelter, testing their limits. But inside, something new and resilient was slowly taking shape, forged in the crucible of shared hardship and the silent understanding that they were, for now, dependent on each other to survive. The snow finally retreated, leaving behind a world transformed, sharp and bright under a cold sun. The cabin, though weathered, had held against the storm. The partnership forged in the forced confinement now extended into the daily rhythm of survival. The man, whose name Sarah now knew was Thomas, worked outside, checking traps, clearing snow, preparing for the thaw. Chaitin worked primarily inside, managing their dwindling stores, mending, ensuring the fire never died completely. And Sarah, the woman who had arrived lost and afraid, found herself no longer shrinking from tasks. She helped Chaitin, hauling water from the partial thaw near the stream, splitting kindling, learning the quiet tasks that kept them alive. Chaitin didn't offer instruction, but she didn't hinder, her presence a silent encouragement. She taught Sarah how to make the most of their meager provisions, how to identify useful plants once the snow melted, how to move through the wild with awareness. It wasn't teaching with words, but with quiet demonstration, with shared labor, with a patient presence. Sarah absorbed it, her fear slowly giving way to a growing sense of capability, a quiet pride in contributing. The silence in the cabin was no longer heavy with unspoken fear, but filled with the sounds of shared work, the crackle of the fire, the rhythmic thud of the axe, the quiet rustle of fabric. The true test came not from the weather, but from the land itself. The early thaw brought unexpected danger. A large, hungry bear, roused early from hibernation, became a persistent threat, drawn by the scent of their stores. Thomas tracked it constantly, his face set. One evening, as Chaitin and Sarah were returning from the stream with water buckets, the bear emerged from the tree line, massive and unafraid, blocking their path to the cabin. Fear, cold and sharp, flooded Sarah, the familiar paralysis threatening to seize her. But then she saw Chaitin. There was no panic in her. Her eyes met Sarah's for a brief, intense moment, not with fear, but with grim resolve. Chaitin spoke, the first time Sarah had heard her voice raised, a sharp, guttural yell in Apache, accompanied by waving arms and stamping feet. The bear paused, startled. Chaitin grabbed a large rock and hurled it, following it with another yell. Sarah, galvanized by Chaitin's courage, dropped her bucket and found her own voice, screaming, picking up rocks and throwing them clumsily. The noise, the sudden aggression from these two small figures, was enough. The bear hesitated, then turned, lumbering back into the trees. They stood trembling, watching the space where it had been. Thomas emerged from the cabin, rifle in hand, his eyes taking in the scene. He looked at Chaitin, then at Sarah, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. Chaitin simply nodded towards the trees, her chest heaving. Sarah, breathless, felt a surge of adrenaline, followed by something entirely new. Strength. She had faced the fear and she had acted. That night, by the fire, the silence felt different. It was a comfortable silence, shared between people who had faced danger together and prevailed. Sarah looked at Chaitin, saw the quiet strength in her face, and knew that this woman, so different from herself, had shown her a path she hadn't known existed, the path of resilience forged in the face of adversity. She looked at Thomas, saw the steady presence he offered, the quiet reliability that had allowed them to build a life here, however precarious. She had arrived here broken, abandoned. But in this harsh place, through the unexpected arrival of a stranger chosen by silence, she had found not rescue, but partnership. She had found her own capability, her own courage. The future was still uncertain, as vast and unforgiving as the land outside their cabin. But now, she faced it not with despair, but with a quiet, earned hope. She was no longer just Sarah, lost and afraid. She was a woman who had stood against the storm, who had faced the bear, who had found connection in the most solitary of places. And that, she knew, was enough. It was everything.